This video is going to be about the images we have seen of CECOT, which stands for Terrorism Confinement Center in English, the Salvadorian mega prison currently holding hundreds of detainees shipped from the United States. We're going to talk here about what the aesthetics of those images are meant to convey. These images are just the latest addition to the history of the creation of spectacles and propaganda by political regimes in order to project power and wordlessly communicate their ideals. We're going to talk about what these images have in common with seemingly disparate images throughout time, from Kim Kardashian's minimalist mansion to modernist urban planning, from Nazi-era parade films to Haussmannian boulevards in Paris, from allegedly white marble statues in ancient Greece and Rome to sleek tech company campuses like Google's. It is incredibly important to have a framework to understand the images that are produced by those in power, including techniques such as the use of blankness, whiteness, emptiness, repetition and sameness, monumental scale, sterility, nostalgia, and legibility in order to communicate ideals like bourgeois values, white superiority, extreme utilitarianism, the awesome power of the state, hyper-rationality, and the suppression of individuality, and the necessity of conforming to neoliberal demands. In this video, we will analyze the images from CECOT and the history of the different visual techniques they use in order to give you this toolkit that you can use to analyze what is called the semiotics of different kinds of propaganda, advertising, and works of art. Semiotics essentially points to the ideologies that are carried within aesthetic choices and the feelings and behaviors they tend to encourage. You may have seen examples where the same clip is shown with different music playing in the background, which changes the clip's tone, since artistic elements like musical genres have the capacity to completely change meaning.
Like, I'm the one
going to be a lot to deal with.
that's dealing with it, and like nobody else has an ordeal to deal with.
Nobody can deal with this like you can deal with this.
I'm so tired, like seriously?
Here's the deal though, you're going to have to deal with this.
Are you serious? No, because do you understand how much I've been dealing with?
Okay, so now it's become this whole
You
big
don't
deal.
understand how much I've been dealing with.
This was also behind the criticism of the use of sepia tones for every movie or TV show set in Mexico, such as Sicario or Breaking Bad, because sepia is typically used to convey historical time periods and therefore portrayed Mexico as stuck in the past. This is also why horror movies tend to use low-angle lighting and tight aspect ratios, while romantic comedies use warm lighting and wide lenses in order to shape the audience's emotions. It's the difference between a beauty ad in soft focus with pink tones versus a Nike ad in grayscale with all caps text and drum-heavy anthems. There are entire industries that centrally revolve around the semiotics of images, such as marketing, communications, fashion, and public relations.
No, nothing's, it's just that both those belts look exactly the same to me, I'm still learning about this stuff and,
This stuff? Oh, okay, I see. You think this has nothing to do with you. You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back. But what you don't know is that that sweater is not just blue, it's not turquoise, it's not lapis, it's actually cerulean. And you're also blithely unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of cerulean gowns. And then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets. I think we need a jacket here. And then cerulean quickly showed up in the collections of 8 different designers. And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you no doubt fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs. And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
People put a lot of thought into the subtle ideologies of the images that you see on a daily basis. So it's important to be armed with information about what it is they are conveying and the ways in which they hope to shape your beliefs and behavior with their choices of things like font, camera angle, lighting, use of color, and pacing. In fact, everything about this video, from the music I chose for the opening credits to the way the images are panned across the screen, carries its own semiotic weight. Panning, for example, is a documentary technique that suggests historical seriousness and evidentiary authority even where none is present.
When a technologically primitive society interacts with a technologically advanced society, that primitive society begins to worship that advanced society. Egyptologists agree that this type of a shape descended from the sky in a giant fireball, made a controlled landing, the Ben stone opened, and people walked out.
The starkness of my filming setup is itself a visual echo of the minimalist aesthetics that I will be critiquing. These choices aren't accidental, and neither are the ones made by the state when it creates images like the ones we're about to analyze. The images that were released by the US and Salvadorian authorities of CECOT, the drone footage, stage photos of the imprisoned, photo ops of government officials, and choreographed visit with Kilmar Abrego were all meticulously thought out to communicate something to you as the viewer at the level of feelings and how those feelings can shape your reaction to ideologies. Let's take a look at which visual techniques were deployed and what ideologies they support. Part 1. Prison architecture. Let's begin with the built environment, which in this case functions as the stage or photo shoot background for these images. There are a range of architectural choices that prison architects make in designing these buildings, to the extent that it is said that the architecture of a prison tells you a lot about the values of the society that built it. Michel Foucault famously argued in his analysis of prisons that discipline proceeds from the distribution of individuals in space. In other words, the physical layout and design of a prison is itself a mechanism of control. Utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham proposed the panopticon design in the 18th century as an ideal way to observe and subjugate prisoners. In a panopticon, a single guard in a central tower can watch every cell arranged in a radial ring, with prisoners never knowing when they are observed. An uncertainty equivalent to a perpetual surveillance system, as he described it. This architecture puts the prisoner in a state of constant visibility, ensuring the automatic functioning of power by making surveillance internalized. A less severe version of this can be seen in open-plan offices, which lead people to perform busyness since they lack privacy in which to engage in more natural workflows. Authoritarian regimes have long manipulated spatial design to assert control. A stark historical example is Baron Haussmann's 19th century redesign of Paris. Under Emperor Napoleon III, Paris's medieval maze of alleys was replaced with grand boulevards, not just for beauty and traffic, but to facilitate troop movement and deter uprisings. Broad, straight avenues made it harder for rebels to build barricades and easier for artillery and cavalry to sweep through. This use of architecture to enforce compliance is reflected in today's TSA lines at airports, which funnel travelers to checkpoints to maintain surveillance at all times. CECOT is depicted in this same lineage, blinding lights that are never turned off, a lack of any shadows or nooks in which there would be any privacy or respite from view, CCTV cameras and guards on catwalks covering all areas with their gaze. If you're thinking, fair enough, this is a prison, modern comparative prison aesthetics actually show a broad spectrum. At one end, extremely harsh facilities built for punishment and control, like CECOT or American Supermax facilities. At the other, facilities emphasizing rehabilitation and normalcy, like some Scandinavian prisons. By contrasting CECOT with the US Supermax and the famous Halden prison in Norway, we see how national ideologies take architectural form. American Supermax facilities such as ADX Florence in Colorado are designed around the philosophy of incapacitation and bare life. They are often underground or in remote areas, built of thick concrete with fortress-like layouts.
The architectural design of AdMax Florence marked a radical shift in the prison system. Each of its 490 individual cells, approximately 7 by 12 feet, was constructed with reinforced concrete and built-in furniture, like a bed, desk, a stool, to prevent tampering or self-harm. The solid steel doors featured small food and document delivery openings, minimizing direct contact between inmates and staff. These doors completely block the view of the hallway, reinforcing extreme isolation. Beyond that, the prison's perimeter is secured with multiple layers of protection, including electrified fences, motion sensors, armed watchtowers, and constant patrols. But it doesn't end there. An underground tunnel network allows staff to move without risking contact with inmates. Florence also incorporates advanced acoustic isolation systems. The cells are designed to prevent sound from traveling, making it nearly impossible for inmates to communicate, even by shouting.
The aesthetic is utilitarian and forbidding. Narrow windowless cells, heavy steel doors, and a complete lack of communal space. Everything is automated. Doors, meal slots, even showers, to minimize interaction. As described earlier, a supermax cell is just a small room of concrete with a toilet and a slit of a window, if any. The color palette is gray and dull. Lights are often fluorescent. This bleak design reflects an American penal ideology that safety comes from total control and that the worst offenders deserve little beyond the bare minimum of living conditions. The visual impression is one of total abandonment. These places look more like tombs or high-security bank vaults than institutions for human beings. At the opposite end of the spectrum, Norway's Halden prison, often cited as one of the most humane prisons in the world, looks nothing like a traditional prison at first glance. Opened in 2010, Halden was designed with a human-centered philosophy. The idea that being deprived of the outside world is punishment enough, and that the prison should not inflict further harm. The architecture reflects this rehabilitative ideology.
Building materials influence humane design too. In other prisons, interiors are made from hard materials like concrete, linoleum, and steel. Materials like this block light, are visually unappealing, and constantly reflect noise. In prisons like Halden, you'll see glass to let in natural light, and materials like cork and wood to muffle noise.
Halden's campus is lush and green, with wooded areas where those in prisons there can actually pick berries. The buildings are modern and low-slung, using natural materials and plenty of windows. Inside, the interiors resemble a college or minimalist Scandinavian apartment. There are libraries, workshops, a sound studio. Cells are more like dorm rooms, each with a door, not bars, a desk, a closet, a comfortable bed, plus a window with a view of nature. There's color and light. Murals by artists adorn some walls. Security is discreet, no gun towers or intimidating barbed wire in sight, though it is still a secure facility.
But humane prison design isn't just about architecture and materials. It's also about what happens inside the walls. Halden's design affects the way correctional officers and inmates interact. Because housing is broken up into small communities with a shared kitchen and communal space, correctional officers can easily monitor inmates through regular face-to-face contact, instead of observing large groups of people from a distance. And the guards' rooms are intentionally designed too small to incentivize them to move out into the inmates' common area.
The overall aesthetic is normalized and dignified. This design stems from Norway's social ethos that prisoners remain members of society and should be prepared for reintegration as healthy neighbors. Architect Steen Gissel, who worked on Halden, explains that the state of incarceration is enough. There will be no further punishment than that. In visual terms, Halden signals trust and care. It looks much like a small village or school, conveying the idea that incarcerated people are still people with potential, not animals to cage. I just want to note, as far as the behaviors encouraged by the architecture of Norway's prisons compared to the US, Norway has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, around 20%. By contrast, the US has a recidivism rate hovering between 60 and 70% within 3 years of release. People say that we can't have a prison like Halden in America because people would want to go there. But that says more about America than it does about Halden. When your baseline is deprivation, Any dignity looks like luxury. The problem isn't humane prisons, it's inhumane poverty. I saw this firsthand when I used to volunteer with unhoused sex workers in Washington, D.C. Some of them would purposefully get arrested around the time of winter in order to have somewhere warm to sleep. Again, this says a lot about the society that surrounds the prison. If we feel we cannot have rehabilitative places like Halden because they would provide more comfort and services than millions of Americans have access to. Then we return to CECOT, which can be seen as representing an extreme on the punitive end of the spectrum, even beyond US standards, because of its sheer scale and overt theatricality. If an American supermax is designed to disappear prisoners from public view, CECOT is paradoxically designed to put them on display as a warning, at least in state propaganda. National flags, terrorism confinement center signage, and the very logo of CECOT have been part of official images, emphasizing it as a proud government project. The prison is a showpiece for President Bukele's Tough on Crime campaign. The fact that media was invited to tour its spotless but harsh facilities and that drone footage of the transfers from the US were released underscores that the visual impact is intentional. The architecture of CECOT also resembles fascist architectural design. Fascist-era building design favored a kind of intimidating simplicity. For example, fascist architecture in the 20th century was characterized by a particular concern given to symmetry, simplicity, and monumental size. The goal was to awe the spectator and convey the absolute rule of the state. Dictators like Mussolini and Hitler built grand structures meant to physically embody their regime's permanence and authority. CECOT, while a prison rather than a public monument, follows a similar logic. Its very scale is monumental, the largest prison in Latin America, and it sits as a fortress compound with 19 watchtowers and double perimeter walls 30 feet high topped with electrified fences. There is no decoration, no color, no variation. A deliberate sterility that sends a message of pure function and discipline. This aesthetic of stripped-down utilitarianism writ large aligns with what Umberto Eco noted about Nazi Germany, which allowed only one official style under Albert Speer, a kind of minimal neoclassicism, which we will return to, tolerating no other styles of architecture. The use of the word utilitarian to refer to both a style, such as utilitarian overalls, and an ethical philosophy reveals an instance where the semiotics are very literal. You've probably heard utilitarianism discussed in the context of philosophical examples like the trolley problem, in which we are asked to sacrifice one person to save many, which undergirds the tortured logic of places like CECOT, which argue that they protect the many by sacrificing the few. There are softer iterations of utilitarianism popular among philosophers today, like consequentialism, that admit that utility might not be the only thing worth maximizing, but historically influential versions of utilitarianism, like that proposed by Bentham, have been rightfully criticized for reducing the value of human beings to numbers which we can manipulate with mathematical functions. I have a forthcoming video that I'm co-creating with my sister on the Hunger Games, and this is part of the reason why the slogan of the games are "May the odds be ever in your favor," reframing human life through a mathematical lens. The series depicts where that often leads. The application of scientific rationalism to human beings places this kind of stark or unadulterated utilitarianism in the same lineage ideologically with movements like social Darwinism and the eugenics movement. You can still see this strain of stark utilitarianism today in movements like effective altruism, popular among techno-libertarians and Silicon Valley types, which seeks to maximize the mathematical impact of charitable actions. This mode of thinking encompasses ideas like working for megacorporations that pollute or abuse workers in order to earn more money to donate later, or even believing that creating infinite consciousnesses inside a cyber world could justify sacrificing humanity in order to build it. The purpose of this video isn't to fully evaluate or provide counter-arguments to these views, many of which are complex and have been advocated in more serious and defensible forms by thinkers like Derek Parfit or Peter Singer. Rather, my point is that the movement of ethical thought started by Bentham, or arguably by the Epicureans, but the same Bentham who dreamed up the panopticon, carries a visual logic that matches its ideological tone. The buildings that house these men in CECOT are utilitarian in both form and philosophy. That isn't a coincidence. Part 2. Sadistic spectacles. Authoritarian regimes often combine architecture with orchestrated visual spectacles to maximize the symbolic impact. In the case of CECOT, US and Salvadorian authorities released dramatic footage, swarms of shackled, tattooed prisoners with shaved heads, stripped to white shorts, forced to huddle together in identical postures. Row after row of men clinging to each other's shaved scalps, overseen by black-clad guards, an image of total domination. This visual has been compared to fascist propaganda because it deliberately reduces human beings to an undifferentiated mass, arranged in geometric precision, conveying the triumph of state order over the individual. These images recall the kind of spectacles seen in 20th century totalitarian regimes. Think of the regimentation of bodies in Leni Riefenstahl's Nazi rally films, or the militaristic mass gymnastics of some other totalitarian governments. There's an aspect of the domination here that could be read as latently sadomasochistic or homoerotic. Someone made the decision to line them up shirtless, holding each other, and said, yes, this is the image. I won't go too deep into that reading since it is speculative, but repression has powered a lot of violent acts between men throughout history, and the line between domination and desire is never as clean as these regimes pretend. In CECOT's images, the prisoners are usually bare, bodies exposed, heads shaved, while the guards are fully clothed, often wearing masks. Visibility for the powerless, anonymity for the enforcers. Psychological studies show that wearing a mask makes individuals feel more powerful and more likely to engage in violence. The naked body is meant to humiliate. The covered face is meant to absolve. These images also echo a longer, disturbing history of domination through public display. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, so-called human zoos exhibited colonized people in cages or staged native villages for white audiences in Europe and the United States. These spectacles turned human beings into objects of visual consumption, bodies stripped of dignity and arranged as proof of racial hierarchy, placed in cages like zoo animals to be gawked at. There is also a similarity in that the people are objectified in the sense of viewed as parts instead of a whole, with their tattoos called out visually and in verbal contexts into which they are placed for particular scrutiny as evidence of difference, much like the body of the so-called Hottentot Venus, Sarah Bartman, was displayed with obsessive focus on her buttocks. The prisoners in CECOT have been deliberately staged in ways that emphasize their tattoos. Their tatted backs, chests, arms, and faces are often turned towards the camera. These markings are meant to signal threat. In fact, US authorities have used a point system to determine which deportees from the US should be sent to CECOT, with one factor being whether they bear tattoos, regardless of what those tattoos signify. One man was sent, for example, because of a rainbow-colored autism awareness tattoo, proof not of gang membership, but of a son's neurodivergence. Historically, tattoos have often served as signs of refusal, marking out the body as ungovernable. From enslaved people using scarification to preserve identity, to tattooing traditions in Samoa that colonizers attempted to erase, to queer and trans communities using tattoos to reclaim bodily ownership. I'm not sure if the state's attempted reframing of the tattoo, itself so personal and symbolic, into its frame of minimalism, whiteness, and blankness has been successful. There's an aesthetic beauty, at least to my eye, that subtly undermines the goals of these images by marking these men out as particular and unassimilable into a mass. Shaving the heads of enemies or prisoners has long been used by occupying powers as a form of domination. During colonization, captives were often shorn to mark their subjugation, sever ties with their past, and render them legible to the colonizing force. In many traditional societies, hair has symbolic power, connected to vitality, honor, spiritual status, or resistance. To remove it forcibly is to sever not just physical features, but cultural and spiritual identity. The Nazis systematically shaved prisoners' heads upon entry to camps. It was a means of erasing individuality and dignity. Survivors often described it as one of the most psychologically devastating moments, signaling the start of complete control over their bodies. It also had practical and propagandistic purposes. Lice prevention, yes, but also visual alignment with the image of these people as unclean, dangerous, or deserving of erasure. After the war, French women accused of collaboration with the Nazis, but who in many cases had just been raped by the Nazis or forced into submission, had their heads forcibly shaved in public. A form of ritual shaming meant to reestablish nationalist purity and gendered control. These acts were often photographed, underscoring the performative visual nature of this violence. In many prison systems, including the US jails and military boot camps, head shaving serves as a leveling mechanism. It removes markers of individuality, personal style, religious identity, or autonomy. It creates a visually coherent, manageable population which is easy to surveil. In the CECOT footage, we see row after row of young men with shaved heads, all crouched in near identical positions. This aesthetic is not accidental. It's part of a visual language of control. Part 3, Minimalism and Whiteness. This may seem strange, but the initial reaction that I had to seeing the images of CECOT was that they reminded me of Kim Kardashian's mansion. Why is it that the aesthetic we see in influencers' apartments, iPhone redesigns, and hellish gulags are all minimalist? Minimalism, whether in architecture, interior design, or branding, often carries connotations of cleanliness, efficiency, and elevated taste. However, critics point out that it can also serve as an aesthetic ideology that imposes a certain bourgeois order and depersonalization on environments. In the context of a prison, extreme minimalism actively works to erase the individuality and dignity of those within. But intriguingly, the same aesthetic values are often celebrated in elite spaces like tech company campuses, luxury homes, and high-end retail. This raises the question, is there an underlying logic connecting the whitewashed hallways of a mega prison and the white-walled office of a Silicon Valley CEO? Historically, modernist architects explicitly framed minimalism as a moral good. Early 20th century designer Adolf Loos, a pioneer of minimalism, wrote that the development of culture is concurrent with the removal of ornaments from objects of daily use. In other words, he equated progress and higher culture with stripping away decoration. This view implicitly disdained the ornamental art of other cultures or folk traditions, suggesting that a clean, blank style was superior and civilized. Such arguments have led some scholars to say that minimalist design has roots in a supremacist mindset, a desire to declare one aesthetic as universally right and clean as opposed to others deemed cluttered or primitive. We see echoes of Loos's philosophy in the way prison architects eliminate any elements not strictly necessary for confinement. Beds are metal slabs, colors are muted gray or white, personal belongings are banned. The unspoken message is that anything personal, decorative, or comforting is a sign of disorder that must be purged. I can't help but connect this in my mind to the images of Kim Kardashian's home or the recent viral video of Ashton Hall's Get Ready With Me morning routine, which both portrayed an inhuman emptiness, monochrome color schemes, and order as aspirational. Wealth in these images is displayed through absence, the sterile superiority of not needing pleasure or clutter. This was remarked upon by commentators of the show Succession, in which the color gray, as well as the cold interiors and monochrome palettes, became semiotic representations of the emotional repression, status anxiety, and prison of performance. Le Corbusier, one of modern architecture's giants, took this even further with what Mark Wigley calls the aesthetic regime of whiteness. Corbusier advocated for a law of Rippelin, or probably Rippelin. Rippelin was a white paint, essentially requiring every wall be whitewashed as a means of cleansing society. He literally suggested that every citizen's home should be forced to have white walls as a matter of public health and morality. White blank spaces were to him a technology of surveillance that would make dirt or disorder immediately visible, thereby instilling self-discipline, in the same way that the central watchtower in the panopticon uses design to habituate people to certain patterns of behavior. In a white minimalist room, any stain or clutter, metaphorically any deviation from the norm, stands out and is shamed. Corbusier believed that this would produce pure, clean, clear, healthy people by essentially forcing an environment of total order. In this way, minimalist design can function as a form of social control. It's not just about taste, it's about making spaces that demand a certain kind of behavior, in this case neat, clean, restrained, compliant behavior, from their occupants. In CECOT, the unadorned concrete and perpetual brightness serve exactly that purpose, to subdue the human spirit into acquiescence. A prisoner surrounded by nothing but blank walls and harsh light, with every movement watched, is encouraged to relinquish any assertive identity and keep in line. One of the most enduring myths in Western aesthetic history is the idea that classical Greek and Roman statues were always white. In fact, they were originally vibrantly painted, adorned with bold colors that brought eyes, hair, garments, and skin to life, a practice called polychromy. But as the paint eroded, Renaissance and Enlightenment artists and historians reimagined antiquity as marble purity, elevating the bare white surface into an ideal of beauty, rationality, and civilization. This wasn't just a mistake. It was ideological erasure, and one explicitly motivated by the desire to assert that Western art was intrinsically different from all other cultures' art, purer, more elegant, less garish. As historians like Nell Irvin Painter have documented, the myth of white marble became a foundation for many modern ideas of racial superiority and aesthetic cleanliness. This is another reason why the official architectural style of the Nazis was a simplified version of neoclassicism, because images of ancient Greece and Rome, stripped of their original color and ornament, came to represent white supremacy itself. In his first term in 2020, Donald Trump issued an executive order called Promoting Beautiful Federal Civic Architecture, which explicitly championed a return to classical Greco-Roman styles for federal buildings. It dismissed modernist and brutalist styles as ugly and posited that beauty should reflect our common heritage, a thinly veiled dog whistle for white Eurocentric ideals. Though it was later revoked by the Biden administration, the order reflected a real and enduring aesthetic ideology on the right, one that conflates symmetry and tradition with virtue and casts deviation, including stylistic diversity, as chaos. In the realm of digital aesthetics, there's also a weird emergence of AI-generated neoclassical cities, utopias, and technocratic dream spaces, often full of marble colonnades, white symmetry, and perfectly ordered streets. These images are popular in seasteading, luxury real estate marketing, and pseudo-intellectual utopianism. They participate in the same fantasy, that rational order is moral order. It's worth noting that fascist aesthetics often operate in two opposing temporal registers. On the one hand, they are deeply nostalgic, reaching back to a mythic past, hence the fascist affection for neoclassicism and monumentality as seen in the Nazi embrace of stripped-down Roman forms. On the other hand, they often lay claim to futurity, particularly through sleek, techno-utopian imagery. In this sense, the fascist imaginary mirrors the dual aesthetic of CECOT and its adjacent spectacles. The prison draws on both the classical and the sci-fi. The all-white sterility, militarized design, and the geometric dominance conjure not only the grandeur of the past, but also send a message of the inevitability of a dystopian future. This split is inherited from movements like Italian Futurism, an art movement whose members were part of the Italian Fascist Party from which Mussolini emerged, and which exalted machinery, violence, and rupture with tradition. We see this clearly in the broader visual culture of authoritarian futurism today, from the mirrored linear cities of the Gulf to the Cybertruck's apocalypse core design. These images do not point towards a future that is open, but rather a future that has already been foreclosed. It's telling that some of today's most influential figures, like Kim Kardashian, increasingly aestheticize our merger with cold, mechanized systems, presenting union with the machine not as dystopia, but as luxury. Kim herself is a cipher, not so much a taste maker as a mirror reflecting the tastes of society in real time as they materialize. But this cold minimalism and Kim's all-white and cream home doesn't emerge from nowhere. It draws on older aesthetic hierarchies, including the racialized association of whiteness with order, purity, and superiority. Visual theorist David Batchelor takes the critique of enforced whiteness further in his book Chromophobia, where he argues that Western art and design have long been structured around a fear of color. Color, he writes, has been cast as the property of some foreign body, usually the feminine, the oriental, the infantile, the vulgar, the queer, or the pathological. It's striking that many corporate and luxury environments embrace a similar minimalist aesthetic of sterility and repetition. Walk into a modern tech headquarters, an Apple store, or the home of a billionaire, touting Zen taste, and you'll often find sleek surfaces, monochrome color schemes, white, black, or gray, and an intentional absence of clutter. This design is meant to exude calm, rationality, and control. It signals that everything is tightly managed and optimized, like a well-oiled machine. But the flip side is that these spaces often feel inhospitable or soulless, and shame aesthetics favored by some marginalized groups, from rhinestones and leopard print to traditional patterns from other cultures. It is important to question the attempt to rob us of the joy that can come from engaging with color, pattern, shimmer, and other popular design elements. This is one message of conformity that, if you heed it, can needlessly sap some of the small pleasures from your life. The use of whiteness to depict not only clean but cleansing aspect of corporate culture, which washes away individuality, was depicted in the show Severance. The Lumen offices, with their bright white walls, endless repetition, and disorientation, create a space where the individual dissolves into obedience. Similarly, the Hunger Games series used the semiotics of whiteness through its fascist dictator, Coriolanus Snow. Snow uses a white rose as his own personal symbol to signal taste, civility, and moral superiority. But what it hides is a system of state-sanctioned slaughter. The all-white outfits of the prisoners in CECOT look like a Skims ad or a group of Kundalini yogis, showing the interplay between ideals of quiet luxury, bodily self-discipline, and fascist aesthetics. This is one aspect of the images that I feel should hit very close to home for their audience. Does your Pinterest board look like this? Does your workplace? Do you see this reflected in the ads you are shown? And why would the same aesthetic cues be presented to you in these everyday contexts that we are seeing in a facility meant to control people's behavior to a minute level and remove all sense of individuality and rebellion from them? It's the same impulse that led Le Corbusier to call white walls a tool to make people masters of themselves by tolerating no action before thought. In a grim twist, the prisoners in CECOT become objects in a minimalist tableau that flatters the state's sense of order. Minimalism here is not peaceful or elegant, it's punitive.
Part 4. Legibility and opacity.
When I speak about legibility to power, I'm relying on the work of James C. Scott in his seminal Seeing Like a State. In that book, he argues that states often prefer imposing neat grids and standardized layouts to make society visually and administratively legible. For example, states introduced uniform last names, straight roads, and geometric city plans to simplify control. Traditional naming practices were often contextual and flexible, People might be known by their occupation, birthplace, patronym, or even by a nickname that only made sense within a small community. These naming systems worked well locally, but they didn't map neatly onto national censuses, taxation systems, or military conscription lists. So states imposed standardized last names, not to help people, but to make subjects easier to govern. The same pattern applied to roads and settlements. Before state-driven rationalization, many roads followed the contours of the land, the habits of foot traffic, or seasonal migration patterns. They emerged organically, shaped by environmental knowledge and everyday use. When planners imposed straight roads and geometric grids in the name of efficiency, they erased the adaptive intelligence that had been accrued through generations. The irony that Scott points out is that these older systems, though illegible to bureaucrats, were highly legible to the people who lived in them. They were based on lived knowledge, mutual adjustment, and improvisation. But to the state, they just look like chaos. So they were rationalized, often with disastrous consequences. In making people and places easier to see from above, the state often made them harder to live in from below. This can be seen clearly in examples of high modernist excess like the planning of the capital of Brazil according to top-down principles, which led to much of the city being abandoned as unlivable and to people forming makeshift settlements of their own outside the city limits. The same desire for legibility that reshaped cities and surnames also devastated landscapes. One of the most famous examples comes from the 18th and 19th century Prussia, where state forestry officials sought to make forests more rational. Traditional forests were complex ecosystems filled with a diversity of tree species, underbrush, fungi, and animals, which were replaced by neat rows of a single economically valuable tree, the Norway spruce. These scientific forests were easy to count, catalog, and harvest, but within a few generations, they began to fail. Deprived of ecological complexity, the trees became weak, the soil degraded, and entire ecosystems collapsed. This was an aesthetic and epistemic choice, a preference for what could be seen, measured, and taxed over what could be lived with. In Scott's terms, vernacular knowledge, which means the accumulated adaptive intelligence of people, was illegible to the state, so it was destroyed. The state saw a tangle and imposed a grid. The way that each room in which the prisoners at CECOT are held in is organized is like a warehouse, with the prisoners not so much on bunk beds as shelves, with no padding. This also creates complete legibility for the guards. The people are organized like documents in a filing cabinet system, which makes their movements more trackable and transparent. This organizes prisoners in space in a manner that is normally only considered appropriate for objects, and that is reminiscent of images we have seen historically of concentration camps. This sentiment was chillingly reflected in the recent statement by an ICE official that we need to create an Amazon Prime for human beings in order to deal with immigrants. Edouard Glissant, a Caribbean poet and philosopher, offered a powerful challenge to the Western obsession with legibility, arguing for the right to opacity. He argues that not everything must be fully understood or explained. Opacity for Glissant is a form of resistance. It's not confusion, but refusal to be reduced to something manageable, classifiable, or useful to the state. To be opaque is to preserve your complexity against systems that would flatten you. This idea echoes the work of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney in The Undercommons, which explores how some communities resist capture not by hiding, but by exceeding the terms of recognition itself. It is a way of living that remains illegible to power because it refuses to be instrumentalized. This resonates with something that I've discussed before in my previous videos, enclosure of the commons, not just as the privatization of land, but as the broader reorientation of the world into units of extraction, surveillance, and control. The commons were not only spaces of shared subsistence, they were also less legible spaces, informal, negotiated, ecological, and plural. Enclosure didn't just take them away, it made them legible. It named owners, fenced boundaries, mapped soil, taxed outputs. It made them extractable, governable, and saleable. This concept, the power of resistance in opacity, as well as the power of color, is referenced in Jane Schoenbrun's I Saw the TV Glow through the title of the show within the movie, The Pink Opaque. Part of the reason the queer characters in this movie are so drawn to the show is that it reflects a politics of being colorful and feminine, rejecting the politics of whiteness we have discussed here, as well as a politics of being opaque and mysterious, rejecting the politics of legibility. In this case, the legibility demanded by systems that would classify us into the gender binary. Thinking about opacity and the undercommons helps us ask, what if the opposite of legibility isn't chaos but freedom? And how can you take steps to make yourself and your community less legible to power? Part 5, Governmental Gaslighting. Next, I want to talk about the recent carefully staged images of Kilmar Abrego, who was deported to CECOT in error by admission of the US government. In photos shared online, Abrego seems to be sharing margaritas in a relaxed setting with a visiting US congressman. The implication is that criticism of CECOT is hysterical, that even those detained there are doing just fine. But the congressman himself later clarified that the images were staged to make it seem as if they were drinking margaritas, even though they both carefully avoided drinking.
President Bukele, after I met with Kilmar, did this tweet showing us at a table with these two glasses. So here's what happened. When I first sat down with Kilmar, we just had glasses of water on the table. I think maybe some coffee. And as we were talking, one of the government people came over and deposited two other glasses on the table with ice, and I don't know if it was salt or sugar around the top, but they look like margaritas. And if you look at the one they put in front of Kilmar, it actually had a little less liquid than the one in front of me, to try to make it look, I assume, like he drank out of it. Let me just be very clear. Neither of us touched the drinks that were in front of us.
And in reality, Abrego is one of many who may never leave the prison. The photos were a troll, a deliberate provocation. This kind of image making isn't new.
This trip was to a Shein factory located in China. Shein took this group of influencers for a tour of one of their factories, and they were posting all about it.
A3. We just pulled up. My mouth, I'm still picking it up off the ground. It's so big.
Today we are at the Shein warehouse where the products come directly from this facility to your home.
I went on a brand trip to China with Shein. I still can't believe it. To the hotel, I freshened up and then went to go have some lunch. Here is my cute little outfit, and again, I got to enjoy the view while eating.
So it's day 2 in Guangzhou with Shein, and today we got to visit one of Shein's leading factories where they produce the clothing. I'm not gonna lie, I really expected it to look like it does in the movies, like really dark and dingy, but I was really surprised to see each piece handled with care, and it was also nice to see our Shein designers there and so happy seeing their products being put into production.
It follows a logic of gaslighting, taking what is known, the torture, the indefinite confinement, the spectacle of degradation, and then producing a counter image so absurd that it dares the viewer to question their own reality. I feel similarly about the pictures of Kristi Noem glammed out of her absolute mind posing in front of the prisoners, or the other lawmakers who have gone to give the thumbs up sign in front of a wall of stacked bodies. To me, this feels like a restaging of Abu Ghraib, but with pride this time, a way of dealing with the shame of that historical moment by doubling down on its gruesome inhumanity. The inhumanity is only reinforced by Kristi Noem's personal aesthetic, what many have begun calling the Mar-a-Lago look. I don't have time in this video for a full semiotic breakdown of this look, but suffice it to say, the group of women currently in proximity to power under the Trump administration appear entirely comfortable, visually signifying their allegiance to inhuman ideals of beauty. The look valorizes extreme thinness, unlined skin, aggressive contouring, and the erasure of natural aging as a kind of purification ritual. It pushes all traces of death, softness, or decay to the visual periphery, and like the aesthetic of CECOT itself, expresses control through denial. The queen of clockable surgery herself, posing with a Tesla bot post Elon's Nazi salute, is another iteration of a woman signaling her compliance with the current political order, helping to normalize and aestheticize it not only with her body, but with her willing participation. She signals compliance with the idea that women themselves should be robotic, smooth, poreless, interchangeable with parts that can be replaced when they age, swapped out for something shiny and new. Kim is essentially a Theseus's ship of a person at this point, simultaneously accepting techno-futurist logics about the perfectibility of humanity, especially for the rich, and traditional regressive logics about the decorative function of the female body. There is no minimalism here, not in the makeup, the hair, or the surgery. But that excess is itself telling. It's not the quiet luxury of wasp restraint or its associated aesthetic of natural beauty. Instead, this is maximalist artificiality, a garish, glossy reaction to what the far right sees as encroachments of trans visibility or of aging women asserting power. Similarly, Trump himself has always refused the aesthetics of tasteful wealth. He doesn't do subtle, and these women, hyper-feminine, surgically perfected, and visually unmissable, reflect that same relationship to spectacle. Part 6. Peripheral images. In any analysis of CECOT, it's not enough to examine the official images that have been carefully released to the public. We also have to examine the ones that haven't been explained, the ones that sit at the edge of the frame, unresolved, ambiguous, and therefore even more unsettling. One is the now infamous Google Earth image of what users are calling a mystery mound on the prison grounds. It appears as an ambiguous raised area near the outbuildings on the edge of the complex, a red-tinged blur. Some social media users claim it resembles a blood stain. Others speculate it could be anything from a construction feature to a burial site. We don't know. This isn't a spectacle designed to control the narrative like the tightly choreographed videos of prisoners crouched in silence. Instead, it's a kind of anti-image, a blurry, unexplained space left open for fear to fill in. This too is part of the visual strategy. Not every terror must be shown. Some are more effective when left just out of reach. The state draws the borders of what can be seen and then weaponizes the uncertainty beyond them. Part of the reason that this image remains uncertain and terrifying is because of an initial choice about where to stage this whole spectacle to begin with. It was staged extraterritorially. I talked a lot about the function of extraterritoriality in my last video on the White Lotus and how it functions to remove responsibility and provide a state of exception in which normal limits can be exceeded. Like Guantanamo Bay, Australia's Manus and Nauru detention centers, or Nazi Germany's concentration camps outside of its own borders, CECOT allows the US to displace the most egregious aspects of its violence beyond its sovereign territory. In my previous video, I talked about the psychology of extraterritoriality and the way that it mirrors Freudian repression, pushing what is disavowed to the periphery in a way that is ultimately unsustainable. Another part of the Salvadoran prison system that we've been shown, and I say been shown deliberately, is a prison work camp. In a video shared by a white American influencer invited by President Bukele, rows of prisoners in yellow t-shirts are filmed laboring at sewing machines, producing uniforms for the prison system.
This is a prison here inside of El Salvador, and each and every single person you see right now in this video are prisoners, helping create a more self-sufficient El Salvador. And each and every single day that a prisoner is working here inside of this factory, they then get 2 days taken away from their sentence. So technically, if you work for 5 years inside of this prison, you are then going to get your time cut in half every single day you work inside of one of the systems they have here set in El Salvador. It is actually pretty amazing. And what price would you personally pay on 2 extra days of your life? Obviously, it's not ideal to be a prisoner. However, here in El Salvador, they are helping the prisoners rehabilitate themselves into society, helping them be able to get a new job if they were to decide to go in fields like this when they're done with their time here in El Salvador. Now, bukele is really changing the country here in El Salvador. It is quite amazing to see.
The influencer frames this as a positive. Prisoners are able to work off their sentences. What we are seeing is the recreation of the workhouse. Imprisonment as economic extraction. It's the same critique that has been leveled against the American prison system, where incarcerated people are often forced to work for pennies. This is a system that's been explored in films like 13th.
The states were required to keep these prisons filled, even if nobody was committing a crime.
It's so difficult to talk about mass incarceration because it has become heavily monetized.
The focus is on taking people from prison, putting them in community corrections, parole and probation.
How much progress is it really if now there's a private company making money off the GPS monitor?
And books like The New Jim Crow. And it's important to remember, many of the people caught in these systems are there because of poverty, because of inequality. Turning imprisonment into labor camps is simply the logical endpoint of a system that treats poverty as a moral failing and labor as a moral obligation. This dynamic is part of what sociologist Loïc Wacant has called the carceral continuum. The way mechanisms of discipline, surveillance, and forced labor inside prisons increasingly mirror the pressures imposed on the poor and marginalized outside of prisons, including most strikingly in the workplace, where we see increased surveillance and discipline of workers.
And in workplaces, many employees have been under surveillance by their employer for a long time. But as the pandemic has forced many jobs to be remote, that surveillance has now followed employees home.
Some companies this morning are starting to monitor their employees more closely than ever.
They track what you click on, where you go on the internet, everything you type into your keyboard.
Employee surveillance has boomed during the pandemic, and the software that goes along with it is flying off the virtual shelves. And these tools do more than just watch employees. They analyze, rank, and
in fact, it's the same ideology we see laundered every day through billionaire mouthpieces. As Kim Kardashian infamously put it,
I have the best advice for women in business. Get your fucking ass up and work. It seems like nobody wants to work these days.
That's so true.
But people in CECOT are working relentlessly. They're working as unpaid performers in global propaganda. We are told that they are the worst of the worst, but are they really selected based on how severe their crimes were, or based on who looks the part of the criminal? The people in CECOT are, to me, like the children of family bloggers, forced to perform for room and board. In El Salvador, there is one prison picked out to be the central image. But we are not seeing images from other parts of the Salvadoran prison system which were not designed to be the showpiece and are said to have much dirtier and more overcrowded conditions than even CECOT. American journalists and lawmakers are vetted before entering CECOT, and the guards are prepared to show them the image that Bukele hopes to project. This obscures what happens there outside the view of the cameras and what happens in other facilities. This is a slight departure from our discussion of semiotics, but it is important context. Most of the deportees sent there were Venezuelan, having fled a country that has faced significant interference with its sovereignty by the United States, as well as devastating sanctions that further collapse an already distressed economy. These sanctions have failed to achieve US diplomatic aims and have instead functioned primarily to punish the Venezuelan people. Many in Venezuela believe the US retaliated against their attempt to pursue a more socialist model and break from neoliberal hegemony. The situation is complicated. Their current president, Maduro, is, in my view, less a socialist than a kleptocrat. But the basic point remains, US actions contributed significantly to the conditions that displaced these very migrants. The case of El Salvador is even more straightforward. The US backed anti-socialist forces to the tune of billions of dollars during the Salvadorian Civil War and later deported gang members, many radicalized within US prison systems, back into the country. Ultimately, this history is actually related to semiotics because this context, this deeper systems-level analysis, is missing from the frame presented to us, whether the image comes from Fox News or the New York Times. Instead, focus narrows onto the individuals themselves, whether to demonize them or occasionally to sympathize with them. Either way, the larger structural story is erased, and that erasure is mirrored in the very visual strategies we've been discussing throughout this video. the blank slate, the suppression of memory, the clean conscience of whiteness. Conclusion. CECOT is not just a carceral facility. It's a visual machine of authoritarianism, a purpose-built monument of control. Every aspect of its design, from its sterile architecture to the choreographed imagery it produces, participates in a semiotic regime that punishes not just the body, but the imagination. What we've seen in these images, the bare bodies, the shaved heads, the spectral lighting, are not neutral. They are carefully curated signals designed to seduce, to terrify, to normalize state violence as order and aesthetic discipline as virtue. But authoritarian design does not only exist in the realm of prisons or propaganda. We've seen how the same aesthetic values, minimalism, repetition, legibility, suppression of individuality, recur in tech campuses, influencer homes, urban planning, and even the bodies of those in power. These are not isolated choices, they're part of a larger ideological project. A project that tells us that control is beautiful, that efficiency is moral, that compliance is calming. What's at stake in reading these images closely is not just an understanding of CECOT, El Salvador, or the Trump-era migration policy. It's the ability to see the aesthetics of power wherever they appear. In your ads, your architecture, your interfaces, your body, your relationships. To ask, what is being shown to me? What is being hidden? What kind of world is this image training me to accept? Because propaganda is not just what the state says, it's how the state makes you feel. And unless we learn to read that language and to feel our way out of it, we risk becoming legible only on terms that were never meant to see us clearly.